Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the Post 56, the Mirror Moment. This is our second installment in our Post Endings trilogy, and this concept of the mirror moment will change how you think about research, change how you become a researcher, but it will also transform how you think about yourself and your relationships with other people. No pressure, but we start with a very, very simple idea, and I have a prop. Yes, it is a handbag. We start with a very simple idea. Tick, tock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. From the analog clock. Very simple device. But what happens in the space between that tick and that tock? Now, we focus on, and we talked about it last week, Genesis and Apocalypse, beginning and ending. We're drawn to beginnings and endings. But what happens in that middle? Therefore, what happens is we invent a series of fictions, imaginings that situate between the tick and the tock. And these imaginings are meaningful, and they certainly are important. This middle matters because it gives you a sense of purpose. Understanding the middle gives you momentum rather than being drawn to some sort of past or drawn to some sort of imagined future. And of course, the fictions that we summon between the tick and the tock were described by Frank Kermode as, quote, an escape from chronicity, end of quote. What a great word, an escape from chronicity. So in this mirror moment that we're going to define shortly, we provide a story and a context about our existence, who we are and how we relate to other people. But we also summon imaginings so that we have a connection with time beyond the tick and the tock, and therefore how we understand that clock and our relationship to it is one of the key questions of our entire lives, let alone our professional lives as researchers and teachers. Now, how do we understand that space between tick and tock? Well, evolutionary biology gives us one example, but the principle of complementarity is another. So that is light as waves and light as particles. And all of that can be reconciled beautifully through mathematics, through a single set of equations that covers the wave and particle effects. Respect to all the mathematicians out there, you rock. But needless to say, as is always the case, this situation is much more complex in physics, because the relationship between waves and particles can only be reconciled through mathematical formalism, as long as the theoretical prediction and the experimental observation converge. The problem is that they rarely do. So uncertainty like this is really, really problematic epistemologically in physics. But it's justified between the discontinuity between small systems and large systems. And of course, classic mechanics is a case study for quantum mechanics, a special case, if you will. Thereby, all of this is making the past complementary with the present. Really interesting. So all of this matters. Why are we talking about physics? All of this matters because it provides us with some ontological information about how we reconcile the past in the present. And also, and I'm impossibly old, and you only realize this, I think, through life, that propositions can be true and false. Waves and particles, love and justice, conscious and unconscious. Timescales matter a great deal between that tick and that tock. George Gubler's great book. I really recommend this wonderful book to just read if you're interested in ideas. But this book is titled The Shape of Time. And he found a hierarchy of durations. So there is what is time for a coral reef compared to a solar year. Okay, so how we fill that space between the tick and the tock is fascinating for research. It's fascinating for researchers. Now, religions and faith structures configure a very strong relationship between behaviour and consequences, but literary fiction is so important because it allows us to move characters round, move time around, create a bit of flexibility in the relationship between tick and tock. These fictions have a purpose. As Karl Marx stated, quote, "The consciousness of the past weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." End of quote. Thanks, Big Carl. Always optimistic. And George Eliot was similarly negative, arguing that, quote, "beginnings are always troublesome," end of quote, and, quote, "conclusions are the weak point for most authors," end of quote. Very interesting. Very interesting in terms of doctoral education, can I say. Conclusions are often the weak point for many researchers. So what's happening in this middle, therefore? Okay, well, whenever we're unhappy, whenever we are in despair, the shape of our thoughts propel us forward to the apocalypse. So what we actually require is not being drawn to the past or drawn to the future. What we require are sense-making methodologies in the middle. So when we write, we also tend to focus on the introduction and the conclusion. And Mick Spillane supposedly wrote that, quote, "the first chapter sells the book, the last chapter sells the next book," end of quote. I love that. And if we reposition that argument in the context of academic research, really your introduction finds an audience for this particular article or this particular book, but your conclusion finds an audience for you as a researcher and the rest of your career. I think that's pretty accurate too. So one of the greatest scholars of this meaningful middle, I think, is James Scott Bell. Wonderful writer, can I say, wonderful writer on writing, and I recommend his work to you. But he argues that meaningful endings emerge from meaningful middles, and that powerful middles emerge from this mirror moment. Okay, let's get into this. What is a mirror moment? Well, it's a concept that emerges from fiction where a lead character looks into a mirror, either literally or metaphorically, and starts to see themselves with clarity and with honesty. So the best example everybody uses when they're teaching this concept is Pride and Prejudice. So we've got Mr. Darcy and Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and both of them lived the title Pride and Prejudice. But as the narrative progressed, they had their mirror moment, realised their problems, their personal issues, and transcended them, and of course a happy ending ensued. Nice. Now, similarly for the Bridgerton Series 3 people, how you going? Now, this whole series was punctuated by Colin's mirror moments. He kept on underestimating Penelope and overestimating himself. And all these mirror moments led to that final, I think, quite remarkable scene after Penelope acknowledges in public that she is really Lady Whistledown. Oh my goodness me, oh my goodness me. And Colin, in his final speech, powerful moment, acknowledges through all of this that he was envious of her. And that's what created his anger and rage and disconnection. That was on him. Brilliant. Brilliant. The mirror moment is useful not only in fiction though, it's useful in research, it's useful in life. The mirror moment allows us as researchers to understand our positionality and how that positionality impacts on our work, our research, our theoretical choices. And what happens when we have this mirror moment as researchers is we recognize our weaknesses, our failures, our missteps. And we also recognize, and this is really important, the consequences of our particular alignment of methodology, epistemology, and ontology. We recognize through our mirror moment what we haven't investigated, what we have not found. And as you know, I've said this for about 30 years. What we don't talk about is actually more important than what we do talk about. So the mirror moment allows us to assess with clarity our strengths, but also recognize our weaknesses and recognize our failures, our incompetence, our ignorance, and our errors. I understand that this mirror moment is pretty well antithetical to how life is being managed at the moment. We have so many poor leaders in higher education and beyond, and these poor leaders have done so very little in their lives and yet talk this big game. And of course, when we go to triangulate who they are and what they've done in their career, we see there actually are very poor metrics, or indeed they've masked their metrics. One interesting proxy for that is, are Google Scholar profiles rendered private? So they can't be seen, so they can't be assessed. And one of the reasons that these metrics and the public nature of these metrics are so important is because these particular leaders are putting all these stretch targets and demands on ordinary everyday scholars. And yet these leaders have never produced work of that standard or that scope or that scale. So they are hypocrites. They're incompetent and they're self-absorbed. And that's not a very good combination to configure a leader. Our time encourages, to quote one of my former bosses, optics and a healthy ego. And he used both those terms, by the way, optics and a healthy ego, as supposedly positive attributes. A mirror moment is the exact opposite of optics and a healthy ego. Because think about what optics actually are. Optics are focused on what's irrelevant, what's not significant, but what is flashy and visible. How a situation appears is not hugely important. How an event actually is, its reality, that's crucial. And as we all know, a healthy ego is absolutely irrelevant. What we need right now, what the culture needs, what every one of us needs, is to sit in our weaknesses, sit in our failures, sit in our errors. And that's not only important in life, but it's necessary to conduct ethical, transparent, rigorous, and repeatable research. Our universities at the moment, particularly our university leadership, is filled with people who are hiding components of their past. They're also rendering very small events incredibly big and catastrophically big events incredibly small. This is, of course, optics. Now, all of this is being done so that an individual human can feel big and can feel important. But in our current era of institutional reviews, regulation, governance, scrutiny over research integrity and academic integrity, this is not the era of optics. These people will be found out. This is the time for honesty, transparency, and compassion. So this mirror moment is crucial for us because it gives us a template, a methodology, if you will, to render our life meaningful. It also allows us to find meaning in and about research. This is the moment where we see ourselves. We see our errors, and then when we see our errors and our failures, we ask the honest questions. How has this happened? What are the consequences of these errors and failures? And what can I do to ensure that they are not replicated? From this mirror moment, we are able to build a rigorous, compassionate, and authentic future. We can build an ending rather than hope for an ending or wish for an ending. But we also need to log the changes in our particular era, and yes, they are catastrophic. Because what's happening is we're all getting sucked into the hyper-real, this hyper-toxic present. As you know from our work last week, we've actually lost the real. We're living in other people's representations, or indeed other people's re-representations. Now, Baudrillard argued that the simulacrum is pretty well sealed up. You can live in it permanently because it has its own referential system, and that is the hyper-real. This hyper-reality is constituted within the simulacrum and doesn't require anything external at all or contextual to render it meaningful or authentic. So in other words, the re-representations appeal to other re-representations for authenticity, truth, and meaning. So there's no real. Images simply talk with other images for verification. Signifiers appeal to other signifiers for verification. Now, remarkably, and this book changed my life, can I say, Anna Kornbluh in her 2023 book described this as immediacy, or the style of late capitalism. So this title resonates off Hegel, obviously, where he stated, quote, immediacy is in itself mediated, end of quote. So she starts her book with the great phrase, it's best to begin in the middle. Fantastic. And she argues that all of us are living in this endless present immediacy. Sense-making and meaning-making structures are blocked in immediacy in this present. So we're living in this present of emotion, having a response, having a reaction, having a feeling. And we're losing mediation through this immediacy. We're losing consciousness through this immediacy. We're losing interpretation through this immediacy. So what is this immediacy that she's talking about? Well, to quote Kornbluh, quote, we are fastened to appalling circumstances from which we cannot take distance. Every single thing is catastrophic and riveting our attention. End of quote. That is our reality. Our mirror moment, therefore, is the antithesis to this immediacy. Our mirror moment demands reflection, re-intermediation, a pause, silence, thinking, research. Without a mirror moment, to cite Kornbluh, quote, omni-crises devour us. End of quote. So when we're living in this immediacy of omni-crisis, we're not making decisions. We do not re-intermediate. We do not create reflection. We do not create space for interpretation. So what happens is we stay in the present. We sit in the wound. But when we reflect, when we interpret, we have to leave our present. We have to exit the wound. We have to think about time and space and consciousness. So we all pretty desperately need mirror moments. Without them, we're floating through images without context. The consequences of this immediacy we understand because we're living it. And one of the causes and the consequences of this immediacy is a narcissism epidemic. This is really the catastrophe of our time. The assumption that the self, the I, the me is the center of the world, and our needs, our thoughts, our feelings are so much more important than other people's, and I therefore have the right to label and judge other people without any consequences of my labeling or my judgment. Now, none of us are the center of the world. We are, to quote the great philosophers, Kansas, dust in the wind. No one cares what we're feeling. No one cares if we live or die. None of us are important at all. So this culture of immediacy is creating this narcissism epidemic. So what that means is if you have a thought, if you have a vibe, you not only have the right to express it, but you have the right to demand an audience for your thought bubble, for your feeling. So these thought bubbles that are really emotional bubbles are replacing expertise and consciousness and reflection. This is what Cornblath described as, quote, the phenomenon of self-engrossment, end of quote, the phenomenon of self-engrossment. Now, we see this in multiple forms in our daily lives. The daily micro memos that exist on social media, and the movement once more back to first person fiction and of course memoirs. I'm on a lot of writing groups online, and it is unbelievable how many people do this public post going, I'm going to do a memoir, I'm writing my memoir because I've had such an interesting life. Have you, girlfriend? Have you? Really? All of this is a bit like Jack Kerouac on meth, right? The reason third-person narratives are so useful is because they provide multiple perspectives on an event or on the world. But we don't live in a time of third-person narration and thinking about diverse viewpoints. We live in a time of I, me, me, me. Other perspectives, other people are parked. To use that great line from Cornblath, this is a, quote, privatisation of perspective, end of quote. A privatisation of perspective. And of course, this serves neoliberalism. And it allows us to, on a daily basis, actively forget about wars, economic injustice, knowledge, reading, silence, listening. Instead, our focus is on leadership. What is your leadership model? Leadership, optics, ego, self, that so quickly moves into selfishness and self-absorbed identity politics. This immediacy is not going to end without intervention. And all of these interventions to enact change begin with a mirror moment. This thickens and deepens our consciousness, our interpretations. It also slows down the social media clock. When we look in the mirror, and it is horrific, I understand that, when we look in the mirror and we really look without all the weird filters and without the me vibe, we start to recognize the errors, the flaws, the failures in our lives. And we also have that great and very important recognition that we are absolutely irrelevant to the planet. We do not matter at all. So for those of us who have buried people that we love more than life, we know how quickly this supposed big life shrinks and disappears. We know how quickly the important life ends up in a skip in the front yard. I'm making literal points here as much as metaphoric points. We can live in immediacy and importance and ego and optics, or we today can choose to action a mirror moment, to re-intermediate our lives and reconnect with other social structures. We can make decisions. We can read rather than comment, and we can listen rather than talk. Now again, I know these mantras are absolutely antithetical to our times, and most of our fellow citizens will never have one of these mirror moments. And to provide just one example, I delivered a keynote a few weeks ago, and after I've done the keynote, I look like, late Las Vegas Elvis, sweating. And so I then moved to the next seminar, which I was really desperate to see. So I'd done the keynote, walked to the next seminar room and got my iPad out. I was really excited, really looking forward to this seminar. And a young guy entered this seminar room and sat next to me. Now that was a bit odd because only about a third of the room was full, right? But he didn't sit in any of those seats. He sat right next to me. Okay, fine. And so I got on with getting my iPad organised and ready to take good notes. And he said, "Excuse me." Now, he didn't introduce himself, give a name, give any sense of who he was. He said, "Excuse me, but did you really mean what you said in the keynote about freedom of speech?" Now, what I'd said in the keynote was freedom to read is more important than freedom of speech, and just because you have a thought doesn't mean you have the right to share it with other people. So I said to him, yeah, I said that in the keynote and I mean it. And then I leaned forward to him and I said, "I'm interested. Why would you think you have anything interesting to say?" He had his mouth open. He was absolutely shocked at my response. And he only replied to me, "You academics always say that." No, I don't know what that means either. Okay, but what I do know is that if we can all summon a mirror moment to enable silence and listening and reading and reflection, then this re-intermediation is a path back to citizens and citizenship and away from consumers and consumerism. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.